The brutal attrition of the Guadalcanal campaign was not merely a battle of resources, but a duel between visible determination and invisible technology. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, IJN, the sea around the Solomon Islands had ceased to be a fluid element of strategy and had become, instead, a graveyard defined by inexplicable aerial losses. Every downed aircraft, every shattered ship, carried with it an unspoken question: how had the Americans suddenly mastered the skies? The answer lay in the tiny, fragile mechanism of the variable time, VT, fuse, a secret the Americans guarded with religious zeal, and a technological leap the Japanese rejected with fatal arrogance. The watch on the Amajurai. Captain Kenjiro Yamashita, commander of the destroyer Amajurai, was a man of the sea, his knowledge rooted in the predictable rhythms of tide and trajectory. Yet, in the early dawn hours of November 13, 1942, as his vessel provided escort for a heavy cruiser division steaming toward the inevitable clash at Guadalcanal, he witnessed an aerial defense that defied every law of ballistics he had ever mastered. The air was humid, heavy with the scent of diesel and tropical salt. A flight of Japanese G-4M Betty bombers, flying dangerously low to avoid the high-altitude flak and maximize their torpedo attack, approached the American cruiser line. Yamashita knew their tactics were impeccable. The low altitude, the tight formation, it was designed to flood the enemy's fire control with targets, forcing their human gunnery crews to fall behind the necessary lead time for time-fused shells. Yamashita raised his binoculars, steadying them against the vibration of his own ship's engines. His focus was on the American cruiser San Francisco, a vessel he knew to be heavily armed. He expected the customary scattering of delayed, smoky bursts that marked conventional flak, a deterrent, but one that could be flown through with sufficient courage and speed. What erupted was something horrifyingly new. The American cruiser did not fire a scattered warning. It fired volleys that converged on the formation with a precision that felt less like targeting and more like magnetic attraction. A shell, fired at an angle that looked miles wide of its mark, suddenly bloomed into a starburst of white-hot shrapnel exactly at the nose of the lead bomber. Then another, directly beneath the cockpit of the second. These were not near misses. They were perfect, catastrophic hits, executed in a sequence that eliminated the entire formation in under 30 seconds. Yamashita lowered his glasses slowly, his vision swimming. His executive officer, Commander Hirota, was pale. "Captain," Hirota whispered, the terror audible, "they did not adjust the altitude. They did not wait for the timer. They fired into the space where the planes were going." Yamashita struggled for an explanation. "It is a new radar. A targeting system that calculates the intercept point in milliseconds. The Americans are using a ground-based control, perhaps on Tulagi, guiding their fire." He refused to admit the possibility that kept flickering in the back of his mind, that the projectile itself possessed consciousness. The observation he meticulously logged that night: "It is not the human hand, but the shell itself which seeks the soul of the machine," was his desperate, poetic attempt to rationalize a weapon that seemed supernatural. He had faced human error, and he had faced the cold mathematics of the enemy. But this new enemy defied calculation. It was instantaneous. It was an unseen wall. The high priesthood of denial. Meanwhile, in the climate-controlled stillness of the Kaigun Jujutsu Kenkyujo, Imperial Navy Technical Research Institute, in Tokyo, the intellectual battle was being waged and decisively lost. Dr. Hiroshi Sato, the institute's leading physicist and a man whose ego was as unyielding as high-carbon steel, held court. Sato was a product of the rigid imperial educational system, precise, brilliant in classical mechanics, and deeply contemptuous of what he termed Anglo-Saxon technological mysticism. The very concept of the VT fuse, a miniature, ruggedized radio receiver/transmitter capable of surviving 20,000 gs of acceleration, encased in the shell's delicate nose, and maintaining calibration to detect a plane hundreds of feet away, was an affront to his scientific worldview. "Gentlemen, let us return to logic," Sato dictated, pacing before a massive, ornate map of the Pacific. "The Americans are a pragmatic, often clumsy people. They do not possess the theoretical finesse for such a leap. Their flak is lethal because they have perfected the mundane. Flawless meteorological data, perhaps a new acoustic homing element, or most likely, a networked fire control system that shares target data across the entire fleet in real time. This is sophisticated logistics, not revolutionary physics. Opposing this dominant narrative was Kenjiro Akizuki, a young, intensely focused radar engineer who had been tasked with trying to replicate the American Ghost Blossom effect. Akizuki, unlike Sato, had started his research from the premise that the Americans must have created a revolutionary proximity device. He had spent months testing early, crude Japanese proximity prototypes, confirming that the G-force stress was the primary hurdle. "Sensei," Akizuki ventured, his voice barely above a respectful murmur, "my calculations show that if the Americans are using a quartz crystal oscillator and a vacuum tube subminiature, specifically fabricated, the theoretical threshold for G-force survival is met. We cannot dismiss the radio frequency possibility simply because we failed to achieve it 2 years ago. The evidence from Yamashita and the pilots is too compelling. The bursts are too frequent, too centered, and too independent of observed weather data to be merely timed fuses." Sato stopped, turning slowly to fix Akizuki with a cold, condescending gaze. "Akizuki-kun, you are falling prey to fear and fantasy. You suggest the enemy has miniaturized a complex, fragile radio system into a robust projectile. This is a 5 billion yen project, requiring years of simultaneous, high-risk research. We have checked. No such American project was known before the war. You wish to waste resources chasing a phantom that flies in the face of engineering common sense. We will focus on jamming their communication links, improving our shell armor, and increasing our pilot training." Akizuki knew he was defeated. His belief in the radio frequency fuse, based on meticulous, desperate reverse engineering of the effects observed in combat, was officially stamped as theoretical distraction. The technical decision was final. Japan would not allocate the immense industrial and intellectual capital required to discover the secret of the VT fuse. Their hubris had sealed their doom, confusing complexity with impossibility. The psychological scars of the skies. The consequences of this denial were not confined to the technical reports. They were etched into the souls of the Imperial Navy pilots. Lieutenant Commander Tadashi Nijima, a veteran pilot who had flown scores of missions over Guadalcanal, began keeping a private tally, a morbid accounting of his lost comrades. "Flying low felt safer," Nakajima wrote in his hidden diary, "because we thought the gunners could not track us quickly enough. Now, flying low is like flying into a razor wire that appears from nowhere. Before we saw the flak approaching, we could anticipate the cloud, dodge the inevitable. Now the explosion is upon you. It is personal, instantaneous. It is like being stalked by a sniper firing an invisible bullet." The psychological shift was devastating. The legendary tenacity of the Japanese airmen, born of confidence in their equipment and their skill against a predictable enemy, began to crumble. When a pilot knows the enemy must lead him by 500 feet, he fights the trajectory. When he realizes the projectile is following him, adapting, waiting for the perfect moment of proximity, he fights a ghost. The American strategy was simple: fire the fuse, fire constantly, and let the technology do the rest. The U.S. Navy gun crews, armed with this terrifying new capability, felt invincible. The South Dakota during the naval battle of Guadalcanal became the ultimate symbol of this shift. Under mass attack, the great battleship's anti-aircraft fire was not sporadic. It was a continuous, adaptive, molten torrent. Shells converged in bouquets of destruction, turning the airspace immediately surrounding the ship into an absolute no-fly zone. The Japanese pilots, witnessing this perfect, continuous curtain of fire, began to use new terminology to describe the enemy's defense: the iron halo, the homing shrapnel, and the terrifying, recurring description of the explosion that kisses the wing, then bites the heart. The failure of the IJN to correctly identify the proximity fuse meant that all countermeasures were fundamentally wrong. They invested in armor that offered marginal protection against conventional flak but was useless against a perfectly centered burst. They insisted on attack patterns that inadvertently improved the VT fuse's effectiveness by providing clearer radar returns. By mid-1943, as the American advance accelerated through the island chains, the technological chasm had become a yawning strategic gulf. Japan was fighting a war of sheer physical bravery and sacrifice, attempting to overcome a technological advantage that fundamentally negated their tactics. The unseen wall had been erected around the American fleet, a wall not of steel, but of applied physics, and the architects in Tokyo, blinded by their own pride, refused to acknowledge the cement holding it together. They were doomed to continue throwing their most precious resource, their trained pilots, against an impossible, invisible shield. This expanded version of Part 2 provides a richer character conflict, greater detail on the institutional arrogance, and a more harrowing depiction of the combat reality, giving it the necessary depth for a standalone publication while remaining strictly within the narrative style established.